Well, hello from my studio in Jersey City, New Jersey. I'm Eric Feigenbaum, and I'm a lifelong New Yorker until very recently. I'm a designer, an artist, a writer, a lecturer, and an educator. I was born and raised in the Big Apple. Actually, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. It was a great place to grow up for an aspiring young artist. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was right at my fingertips. It became my temple. It was a great place for me to go and to visit. I just loved spending an afternoon with my very good friends, Claude Monet and Degas. Also, while I was studying art in college, Soho, the Soho district of Manhattan, well, it was the art center of America. Every single door on West Broadway, and I mean every door, was an art gallery. And this was awesome to a young artist. This was so inspiring for me. Now, 3 years ago, I moved to the other side of the river. I moved to New Jersey, and this was a very big deal for me. I was very nervous about it because, as I said, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I'm the quintessential New Yorker. New Yorker is in my heart. It's at my core. So I was very nervous about moving to Jersey City, but it turned out to be a great move. Jersey City sits directly across the Hudson River from Lower Manhattan, and it's the most diverse city in the country, and it has a very robust art scene. In fact, the Centre Pompidou will be opening I don't know if you know this, it will be opening a branch in Jersey City in just 2 years. And this is going to be just a 15-minute walk from my home. And yes, I am very excited about that. Now, I'm living in a building that is the largest Art Deco residential renovation in the country. The Art Deco detailing in this building is simply remarkable. And that too has been very inspiring to me as an artist. It's an historic landmark building, and I just love my 14-foot ceilings and my spectacular view of the New York Harbor. From my living room, I look to the right and I see the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. I scan a little bit to the left, and right under my window is the Statue of Liberty. Every morning when I wake up, I say, "Good morning, Miss Liberty," and it's just awesome. And when I look directly across, I see the Freedom Tower, and I look a little bit more to my left, and I see the Empire State Building. Now, this environment is so conducive to my painting and to my writing. I'm often sitting at my desk at 2 o'clock in the morning, looking at the New York skyline and typing away as I write my next chapter of my book or the next article that I'm writing. Now, in terms of my career, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an artist, a designer, a writer, a visual merchandiser. I graduated college with a degree in art, and I wanted to be a painter. So what did I do? I set up a painting studio in Brooklyn. As I said, I grew up in Brooklyn, and everything was fine with the world. I was painting away until one day there was a knock at the door. Who was it? It was the landlord. Now, what did the landlord want? He wanted his rent money. And I knew then and there that I had to get a real job. But I wanted a career, a job related to the art world. So I got a hold of the Sunday New York Times. In those days, there was no internet. You had to pour through the classified sections of the New York Times to find a job. And I went from column to column to column, and nothing appealed to me. Just another boring everyday job. And then there it was, a visual merchandising trimmer. And I said, well, what is that? I had no idea that there was even something called visual merchandising. I had no idea there was a whole career that could be developed out of visual merchandising. So I tried it. I took the job. It was a local store on Long Island, and I was an entry-level visual merchandising. In those days, it was called display. I was an entry-level display trimmer. I tried it. They loved me. I loved it. It became the beginnings of my career. Now, I often tell my students, I reflect on my first day of work as an entry-level visual merchandiser. And 5 o'clock came around, and all my entry-level colleagues looked at their watch and said it was 5 o'clock, and it's time to go home. I looked at my watch. I said, it's 5 o'clock. What could I do next? Now, as an educator, I could tell within 5 or 10 minutes of speaking to a student if he or she is going to make it or not. Because you can teach design, you could teach art, you could teach photography, you could teach principles of color. What you can't teach is passion, is desire, is drive, is fire in the belly. And to advance in any career, particularly in my career, you need that drive, that fire in the belly. So I worked really hard in those first few years. I was very quickly promoted to a regional, well, first I became a visual merchandising manager in a branch store. Then I was quickly promoted to the Long Island regional coordinator with oversight of 10 stores on Long Island. So very soon after that, I was promoted to the corporate director of visual merchandising. I held that position for 14 years. And after 14 years in that position, I left to join the largest retail architectural firm in the world, Walker Group. And that's where I began my amazing travels across the world. Now, what is visual merchandising? I'm often asked that question. And the answer is actually twofold. Retail, if you think about it, retail is naturally the showplace for new ideas, new concepts, new products. All of these products are very, very exciting. Retail captures that excitement and communicates that excitement to the targeted customer through the language of visual merchandising. The store is a tool of communication. And the vehicle for communicating, for creating the dialogue, is visual merchandising. Quick example. The trend in retail architecture today is open glass facades. Why? Because as I said, the store is a tool of communication. You have an open glass facade. You begin that dialogue when the customer is still across the street. If a store is designed well, it continues to communicate to the customer. Visual merchandising. I mentioned that retail captures the excitement of new products. Retail, if you think about it, it's the showplace for new ideas, new concepts, new products, and they're all very exciting. The store becomes a selling stage. It becomes the theater for these new products. Now, secondly, in terms of visual merchandising, to me, visual merchandising is the communicator of the brand. The question, why does the shopper shop in one store rather than another? Why does a shopper carry a shopping bag from the store at one end of the mall and another customer will carry a shopping bag from the store at the other end of the mall? The answer to that question is image. Everyone watching me speak today has a personal style, has an image that's theirs and theirs alone. Every retailer must develop an image that is uniquely theirs, an image that sets them apart from all of the others. Before designing a store, and I've designed stores all over the world, whether I'm designing domestically or internationally, before I put pencil to paper, I ask my client 3 simple questions. And I'll ask you the same questions. Who are you? What do you have to say? How do you say it? These are 3 questions that every retailer must ask of themselves. Now, visual merchandising was a task usually relegated to some strange guy in the basement of the store, in the corner of the basement of the store. They wanted him out of the way. Now, this guy had a 16-year supply of birds and flowers. He had a rainbow of crepe paper. He had a storeroom filled with crystal chandeliers and wine coolers. And he would come out of his corner studio in the basement every once in a while with all of his stuff to highlight one single piece of merchandise. And more often than not, he selected merchandise that appealed to him. And more often than not, he overwhelmed the merchandise with all of that stuff. All of that stuff isn't the story. The merchandise is the story. The stuff should be used to help tell the story. Now, that guy in the basement no longer exists. I know I used to be one of those guys. Visual merchandising has gone from the basement studio to the executive boardroom. It's the wise retail executive who recognizes the importance of visual merchandising as a vehicle to project a brand image, to connect with the customer through your brand. And it's the wise CEO of any retail organization that will save a seat for the visual merchandiser around the board table. It must be noted that everything, or nothing in retail design is done randomly, is done haphazardly. There is always a purpose to everything that we do, and that is visual merchandising. Visual merchandising is the communicator of the brand. And I've enjoyed a wonderful career in this field, and it's given me the opportunity to travel all over the world. As I said, I first began my international travels while I was working at Walker Group. My first international challenge was a store in Ulsan, South Korea. Now, when in my life would I ever have gone to Ulsan, South Korea, if it wasn't for my work in visual merchandising? They were building a 350,000 square foot store in the heart of Ulsan. The name of the store was Joywan. And they were very eager for what we knew about retail design, for what we knew about visual merchandising, about store presentation. And they hired us to design the store, to build the store. My role was to design the visual merchandising presentations, and it was also to train their staff. It was also to write a visual merchandising manual based on who they are. Remember, who are you? What do you have to say? And how do you say it? Based on who they are and based on their culture. And this was my first foray into international retailing and design and travel. And actually, I was one of the first to bring visual merchandising to Korea. Shortly after my this first adventure, if you will, in design challenge, I actually visited Korea 5 times during this period as we built this store. While we were doing that, I hooked up with a group from Santiago, Chile. The name of the store was Ripley Department Store. It's one of 3 major department stores in Chile. And there too, we were building a store. And my role, again, was to develop their staff, to develop their visual merchandising presentations. And this was just a wonderful, wonderful experience as well. Now, it must be noted that whenever we did any international work, The first step in the process was a 2-week cultural immersion where we did nothing but immerse ourselves in the culture, in the society, in who they are and what they're all about. It's a big mistake to just jump in and think that we can apply what works here in the United States to somewhere in South America, to somewhere in Asia. So the 2-week cultural immersion was absolutely critical. Today, I continue my traveling, a very robust travel schedule until the pandemic, of course. I've been, in the last 2 years before the pandemic, I've been to Asia many, many times, to Europe many, many times. I've given lectures, I've given presentations from Dusseldorf, Germany, to Ancona, Italy, to Milan, Italy. Most recently, right before the pandemic, we took an amazing 3-week tour of South America, where I gave presentations in 5 cities, in 5 different countries, I believe it was. We first stopped in Santiago, Chile, then we went to Medellin, Colombia, Bogota, Colombia, Cartagena, Colombia, Lima, Peru, and lastly, Sao Paulo, Brazil. So my work in visual merchandising has taken me all over the world, and it's been simply amazing. Now, earlier I mentioned that I'm also an educator. I've taught on the college level for over 20 years. I was the chair of visual merchandising for a small college in New York, LIM College, where I developed the very first 4-year degree in visual merchandising. And then after that, I went on to develop the first master's degree in visual merchandising. I also taught at FIT in New York, the Fashion Institute of Technology. I taught the 7th semester store design in that capacity. So education has been a very big part of who I am and what I do. I'm a founding member of PAVE. PAVE is a partnership for planning and visual education. We started this organization, well, a long time ago in 1992. I was one of 9 folks who started PAVE. And at our last count, at our last event, we had 900 people. So educate, and the reason we started PAVE was to ensure the future of visual merchandising through education. So education has been a very important part of who I am. I'm also a journalist. I'm the New York editor and editorial advisor of Visual Merchandising and Store Design magazine, VMSD. I've been doing that for, well, since the year 2000. I've written well over 100 articles, and every month I do a blog about retail, but about also what's going on in our culture and in our society. In my articles, when I write about stores, I like to take my reader on a tour of the store. I like to walk them through the store, to look at what they might not see otherwise, to give them a view. And this has given me a wonderful opportunity to speak to so many store designers, architects, to present a different perspective of what the store is. Currently writing a book about mannequins, and the title of the book is Profiles of the Mannequins. Now, there are many, many books out about mannequins. This one will be very, very different. Yes, sure, I'll cover the history of the mannequin, but I'm also going to delve into, in great depth, into the people, the makers, the designers, the users, the people who have created magic with these fabulous forms. Now, mannequins, it has to be understood, they're very taken for granted. Mannequins, sure, they're the quintessential silent sales force, but they're that and so much more. To me, they're actually an art form. The study of mannequins, well, it provides a very fascinating look into our culture, into our history, and into sociology. Mannequins really mirror who we are at any given point in time. As we have evolved, well, so too has the mannequin. And just as art, just as fashion, well, these serve as bookmarks of our times, so too does the mannequin. Now, mannequins date back to ancient Egypt, believe it or not. In 1922, when King Tutankhamun's tomb was opened by archaeologists, they found a carved wooden torso in the likeness of the boy king, and they believe it was there to model King Tut's very elaborate wardrobe. First indication of the mannequin. Now, mannequins first struck a pose in America, well, in the early 1900s, and this is what's important. Retail always responds to the latest and the greatest technology. A great example of what's happening today. Well, the great technology of the day in the early 1900s, well, it was two things. It was cast iron architecture, and there was plate glass. What did this do? Cast iron architecture allowed for great expanses of space. Plate glass covered the great expanses. What did you get? You got the first show window. Show windows became retail theater. And the actors on the stage, guess what? The actors on the stage were the mannequins. Now, the early promise and excitement as the 20th century began to blossom, it brought the beginning of the mannequin as we know it. It's the mannequin as a bookmark of contemporary culture, the mannequin as a bookmark of modern society. And it was really the advent of the Industrial Revolution that pushed this along, because it was the Industrial Revolution that brought about the birth of the department store. Now, we think Macy's has always been here, but that's not the case. We think Galeries Lafayette has always been here. Incidentally, while I was at Walker Group, we designed Galeries Lafayette in Paris, another great experience. Well, the department store, the true roots of the department store can actually be traced to the American Civil War. Right after the American Civil War, the United States went from an agrarian or an agricultural society to an industrial society. We had factories in the North that were producing goods. The factories gave people jobs. People worked the factories, they made money. People made money, people had money, they bought more, they spent more. So the factories created more. So it became a self-supporting machine. The factories made goods, people had money, they bought more goods, the factories made even more goods. America became the land of desire. People wanted more today than they had yesterday. People wanted more tomorrow than they had today. Soon there was a glut of merchandise on the market. So what was the solution? These great big retail emporiums, these big stores with all of these goods within, but nobody quite knew what to do with these goods. And herein comes visual merchandising once again. One of the first visual merchandisers, believe it or not, was L. Frank Baum. Some of you may be wondering who L. Frank Baum was. L. Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. Now, what does The Wizard of Oz have to do with visual merchandising? And I'll tell you. L. Frank Baum was one of the first visual merchandisers because 2 years before he wrote The Wizard of Oz, he created a visual merchandising publication called The Show Window. And in that first publication, he said this: bring the goods out in a blaze of glory, make them look like jewels. And that is visual merchandising. Now, in terms of mannequins, getting back to mannequins, in the early 1900s, mannequins were very idealized. They were the view of a man designer, what a man's perspective was of the perfect, quote unquote, female body. That changed as time went by, thankfully. In the 1930s, during the Depression, mannequins were made to look like movie stars. Again, remember I said mannequins really mirror who we are at any point in time. In the 1930s, well, times were tough. We were in the middle of a depression. People barely had enough money to get by. And when they scraped a few pennies together, what did they do? They went to the movies. Well, the mannequin designs picked up on this, and they started to design mannequins and build movie stars, from Greta Garbo to Clark Gable, right across the line. And how brilliant was that? You too could look like Valentino in this shirt. So mannequins were made to look like movie stars during World War II. Again, mannequins mirroring what's going on in society. Well, mannequins became shorter. Why did mannequins become shorter? Because rationing was the order of the day. There was less material. If the mannequins didn't become shorter, well, you would have been looked at as being unpatriotic. The mannequins became shorter because they used less material. In the 1970s, with the advent of feminism, mannequins became more confident, more self-assured. So mannequins, well, they project a point of view. They project a lifestyle. They're front and center for retailers trying to lure customers back into stores as technology forces retailers to make the in-store experience that much more compelling. There are so many wonderful stories about mannequins, and I'm going to tell you two of my very favorite stories about mannequins. And one is about a mannequin designer named Lester Gabba. Some people thought Lester was a little nutty. Lester designed a mannequin called Cynthia. And Cynthia was a sitting mannequin. And wherever Lester went, he brought Cynthia with him. If he went to the theater, who was sitting next to him? Cynthia. If he went out to a fancy restaurant, who was sitting next to him? Cynthia. Everywhere he went, Cynthia was by his side. And yes, people thought he was a little strange, but he laughed all the way to the bank. Because before long, everybody wanted Cynthia. Every time there was a launch of a new product, they wanted Cynthia there to present the new product. Cynthia was at his side all the time, and before long, Cynthia actually graced the cover of Life magazine. Cynthia actually had her own radio show. That's how popular Cynthia was. But then one day, Cynthia was at the launch. I believe it was at a cosmetic launch. She was sitting in her chair, smoking a cigarette, mind you, and somebody knocked into Cynthia. Now, in those days, mannequins were made out of plaster. Remember I said earlier that retail is quick to embrace the latest and greatest technology. The very first mannequins were made out of wax. And what is the problem with the wax mannequins? When you put them into those brand new show windows that I talked about, what happened? They melted in the heat. The next technology was plaster. They wouldn't melt in the heat, but they weighed 200 pounds each. And if you dropped them, they went to 2,000 pieces. And that's exactly what happened to Cynthia. Somebody knocked into poor Cynthia. She fell to the ground and she went to 2,000 pieces. Lester Gabba was devastated and he never rebuilt Cynthia. That was the end of Cynthia. My other very favorite mannequin story involves Salvador Dali. We all know about Salvador Dali. He was hired by a New York department store, an upscale New York department store called Bonwit Teller, to create a window. And he created a window that he called Narcissus White. And in the window, he took a mannequin, put her in the bathtub, filled the bathtub with murky water. Out of the murky water were 7 arms, each holding a mirror focused on the mannequin's face. And the mannequin had a wig filled with blood and beetles. Customers walked by and they looked at Dali's window and they were appalled by this. Store executives walked by and they looked at Dali's window and they were appalled by this. The executives called the maintenance staff to change Salvador Dali's window, and they did just that. Next, Salvador Dali came walking down the street and looked at his window and saw that it was changed, and he flew into a rage. He ran into the store, ran into the window, picked up the bathtub, and threw it through the glass. The police were called. Salvador Dali was arrested, and he was fined $500. And this is what he said. If I ate all of New York, I wouldn't have gotten as much publicity as I've gotten out of this. And those are my 2 favorite mannequin stories. So I've done a lot. As I said earlier, I'm an artist. I have always had also a keen interest in writing. Now, I come from a very musical family, but I'm not musical at all. That gene somehow passed me by. And yet, all of my work, be it painting or writing, has a very definite rhythm and flow to it. Although I'm not very musical, I really do regard music as the highest form of art, with the ability to instantly change the listener's emotions, the ability to instantly take you from one state of mind to another. To me, this is art. To me, craft enters the realm of art when it moves the emotions. Now, I could say the same thing about visual merchandising. When visual merchandising moves the customer or the viewer's emotions, then you'll be successful. This is true of painting, this is true of photography, this is true of fashion design, and as I said earlier, it's certainly true of music. Now, in all of these endeavors as an artist, to me, symmetry is merely okay. Whether I'm doing a window, whether I'm designing a store, even when I'm writing a book, but particularly in the creative composition, in the painting, symmetry is merely okay. To me, balance is what's important. Balance creates a dynamic, it creates a force field, it creates energy, it creates life. While I was at Walker Group, every executive was asked to write a personal philosophy. So when we had a client, we can tell the client, this is who Eric is. So I wrote my personal philosophy and handed it in. And the executives at Walker Group, knowing that I was a writer, were expecting a long treatise about what my philosophy is. I handed them a piece of paper, and it had one word on it. And that word was balance. To me, balance is more important than anything. Also, in my art and in design work, mind you, I've been very, very influenced by Constantine Brancusi. Brancusi's most famous sculpture, and it's here in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, is Bird in Space. Now think about it. A bird is a complex entity. It's got wings and feathers and beaks and claws, and it's got all this stuff. But what did Brancusi do? He reduced it to a very simple line. Now, as a store designer, I could take a leap of faith and make an analogy between that and a store. What is a store? A store is a very, very complex thing. It has styles and colors and silhouettes. It has all of this stuff. The role of the visual merchandiser is to simplify it, is to edit it. And what did Brancusi do? He edited the bird down to this very simple gesture. And he said 4 simple words that have influenced me as a designer more than any other words. And I'm going to share them with you. And here they are, 4 simple words. Simplicity is complexity resolved. Think about it. Simplicity is complexity resolved. This has really influenced me, my work as both an artist, a designer, and even as a writer. Now, as a painter, I'm a colorist. I've been very inspired by the works of the Fauves and by the works of the German Expressionists. Most notably, I've been very inspired by Franz Marc, by Andre Derain, by Max Beckmann, by Henri Matisse. But my absolute art heroes are Claude Monet and Michelangelo. Now, I first began to appreciate the magic of color while I was in 5th grade. We were putting on a play about Abraham Lincoln, and I incidentally had the starring role of Abraham Lincoln, but I also had another task. I was tasked with designing and painting the scenery for the show. And I was at my easel painting the Lincoln Memorial, and I was putting on gray paints, and brown paints, and black paints. And my teacher, Dr. Gross, who I will never forget, came over to my easel and he started to splash on greens and oranges and blues and reds. And Dr. Gross totally changed my life that day. The other defining moment for me as a young artist came in college when I was working. My professor was Professor George Clancy. And he loved my work, but he said it was too static. It's a little too stiff. And I took this to heart. I went out and got the largest pieces of brown wrapping paper that I could find. I pinned them to the wall. I pinned a space of, let me see, it was 10 feet by 8 feet. It was big. Got my paintbrushes in one hand, got my palette in the other. And what commenced was an orchestration of controlled chaos. I just freed up my whole style. Paint was flying everywhere. It was an orchestration of color, of light, of shade. And this really, really freed up my art. And this too changed my world as an artist. The next point of inspiration came when I met a painter, a Hudson painter named George Kelly. And George made a career out of painting the Hudson River with beautiful, beautiful shades and colors and hues. And this kind of opened up a whole new world for me as an artist as well. And I also have been very inspired by the Hudson River School of Painters, most notably Albert Bierstadt. These folks also made a career out of painting the Hudson River. And one of their favorite motifs was Storm King Mountain. And this became a favorite motif of mine. It became my Mount Saint Victoire, if you will. From these lessons, from Dr. Gross, from Professor McClancy, from George Kelly, I started to develop my own painterly approach that was mine and mine alone. I would describe my paintings as expressionist landscapes. Color and texture, for me, rule the day. They are of utmost importance. I like to build volume by layering color and texture in a very painterly, very impasto manner. Now, my very first showing was in 1976, a little while ago, at the Lagoa Duncan Galleries in both New York and in Paris. Miss Duncan apparently took a real liking to my work after showing my work in her gallery on Madison Avenue. She sent some pieces to her gallery in Paris. Soon after that, I had a showing at the Waverly Gallery in New York City. And then I went on to the Hastings on the Hudson Gallery in upstate New York, and then the Woodstock Artists Association in upstate New York. But after my career in visual merchandising took off, and it really did take off, my painting and my exhibition schedule, well, it tapered off quite a bit. I devoted full concentration to my retail design work. My painting, ironically enough, was reinvigorated by the year of lockdown due to the pandemic. We were all hidden away in our homes, and I was getting very frustrated. Prior to the pandemic, I had a very, very robust travel schedule. I was flying all over the world. I was lecturing. I was giving workshops. I was speaking in front of large international audiences. But here I was stuck at home. So frustrated at not being able to travel, I began to paint. And I began to paint with a new enthusiasm. During the past year, I completed 20 oil pastels. And what it was a travelogue, if you will, of all of my amazing trips over the past several years, from Rio to Rome to Sydney, Australia. By the way, a couple of places I always dreamed about visiting, but never thought I would. One was Milan, to see the great cathedral there. The other was to Barcelona to see Casa Mia and all of Gaudi's incredible work. And the third place I always wanted to visit was Sydney, Australia, to see the Opera House. I never thought in a million years I would get to go to Australia. A year before the pandemic, I went there twice in 1 year. Again, because of my career in visual merchandising, I was giving lectures to large audience of retailers, and I was also giving lectures at the college level in Sydney, Australia, at TAFE, North Southwest University. The paintings that I did recently in the studio, the oil pastels, well, these were a celebration, if you will, of all the ports of call that I visited, but they were also a celebration of color. In these pieces, what I did, working in oil pastels, I experimented with using different viscosities of pigment. In other words, I would go from lean to fat. I would use very dry pigments on the first layer, then the medium level of viscosity on the second layer. And then on a trip to Paris, by the way, I found oil pastels called Senolia. And these are the most rich and creamy pastels I've ever worked with. And Senolia was developed actually for Pablo Picasso. Monet went to their store in Paris as well. And as I walked through the store and I heard the creaking floorboards, I just couldn't help but thinking of my hero, Monet. Anyway, the Senolia paints or oil pastels was the last layer that I would add on. So by adding layer and layer of increasing viscosity, you created volume, you created a glow, you created almost an iridescence of color. And this is where I am right now, doing these paintings. Even in my work as a visual merchandiser, color was of utmost importance. Color is both an art and a science. And as most of you know, every color evokes a distinct psychological response. Both the painter and the visual merchandiser totally understand this. Now, one of the other things that I do is I do workshops. I conduct a workshop here in New York twice a year, in December, and then in July. I work with a wonderful group called Windows Wear. We also take the workshop on the road. The furthest I've taken the workshop was to Curitiba, Brazil, where I spoke in front of 50 architects and retail and visual merchandisers. And what we do is we go into all aspects of visual merchandising, from composition to color to lighting to line to mannequins to store design to fixture design. And it's an interactive experience. One of the first things I challenge my students to do is to do an introspective self-store audit, to look at this store as the customer would look at this store. And this has opened many of their eyes as to what they're doing well and what they could be doing better. And retail is an ever-evolving endeavor, and you always have to stay one step ahead. I don't believe in following the trends. I believe in making the trends.
I was wondering if you could tell us, why do you like oil pastels so much?
Okay, oil pastels has been a great find for me, actually. I used to do them as studies for larger canvases, and then I realized, you know what, these are paintings in and of themselves. And it took a lot of experimentation to get the oil pastels to where I want them to be. As I said, experimenting with different viscosities of the oil. And I find that it really, as a colorist, gives me great scope for portraying a full rainbow of brilliant, brilliant colors. I love the brilliance of the colors, the brilliance of the palette, how one color interrelates, reacts to another color. But mostly I love oil pastels because it gives me this ability to layer using different levels of viscosity, because this creates the volume that I'm after. This creates the uniqueness that I'm after. And I've developed a style. And here's a trick of mine. Not only do I use the oil pastels, but I use colored pencils to highlight certain parts of the canvas. And with the colored pencils, I actually can scratch away some of the oil pastel to reveal the lower layer below. So I build up with layers of pigment, and I take away, revealing what's below. So I find that the oil pastels give me great versatility and a great ability to show color in very different ways. asked me about my photography. Back in college, I did study photography, and what I've done with this past year of painting is recall my photography that I've taken along these amazing trips, and I've used them to inspire my painting. But in photography, just like in visual merchandising, just like in design, just like in painting, it's all about composition, it's all about balance, repetition, the angle. One of my favorite photographs was by called the steerage. And what made this photograph wonderful was the angle of the photograph. You know, putting an angle into an image, into a composition, again, creates a dynamic, creates a force field, creates energy. Stieglitz, I'm sorry for a moment, that escaped me, by Stieglitz, the steerage. So my photography, I look for the right angle, the right lighting, the right point of view. I try to edit out a lot of noise. And I look for what people would take for granted, it would not give a second look. And I help them to take that second look and see things that they never imagined before. So that's who I am. Again, I've done a lot of things during my career, from traveling the world to designing to writing to painting.
How do you see the future of visual merchandising now that we are getting more into virtual reality?
All retailers are very concerned. What is next? And that has always been the concern of retailers. As I said, retail has always been very quick to embrace the latest and greatest technology. And there has been a debate, and the debate rages on: brick and mortar or digital. Well, it's not brick and mortar or digital retailing. It's brick and mortar and visual and digital retailing. The two must work together. The two must be spiritually united. You can't have one without the other. And believe it or not, digital is helping the store, not hurting the store. There's a term that's being bandied about, and it's omni-channel. And I do not like that term. I like omnipresence. I think the store has to connect with the customer from many different platforms. The store is not going away. To me, the physical store is the most important touchstone of the brand. What the stores have to do, though, is they have to up their game. They have to give the customer more reason to enter the store. They have to entice the customer into the store. Now, you know, I often talk about the history of retail. Back in the day, in the early days of the early merchant princes, the John Wanamakers, the J.C. Penney's, they had mechanisms, they had tools of enticement, ways to bring the customer back into the store. And I like to think about the 4 A's of enticement. First A was architecture. These great buildings that drew people into the stores. The second A was advertising. John Wanamaker said the time to advertise is all the time. The next A, and perhaps the one most near and dear to my heart, is art. The early merchants brought great art into the stores, from the Impressionists to George O'Keeffe to Boardman Robinson, bringing art into the store. You won't believe the fourth A, back in the day, the fourth A, well, it was hot. It was July. It was summer. The fourth A was air conditioning. Ways to bring customers back into the store. That's what retailers have to do today. And they're going to do it with compelling visual merchandising presentations. Those stores are not going away. They're going to work hand in hand with e-commerce, with digital commerce. And in fact, right now, as I walk the streets of Manhattan, I see the city is coming back to life. I walk through Central Park and it's bursting with life, and people are eager People want to get back into a physical store. They want to kick the tires. They want to try the merchandise. They want to see the merchandise. They want the experience. And it's all about the experience. What retailers have to do today is provide an experience. Give customers a reason to come back into the stores. So stores are not going to go away. They're going to work together with digital. In fact, the new storefront is your telephone. You'll see your retailer on the phone. You'll see what they have to offer. You might buy it online. You might buy it online, pick it up in the store. You might see it online and go to the store. The two are going to work together. It's not omni-channel, it's omnipresence. Retail has to connect with the customer on many, many different platforms. Retail is not going away. Well, what I would like to add before we wrap up, this has been a challenging year for everybody. And I think we have to face things in a positive manner. I think we're going to build it back better than it was before. I think as an artist, art adds value to life. It adds joy to life. Go out to Central Park. Go to museums. Go to movies. Go out there. Do things. Read poetry. Read the Sunday New York Times. Know what's going on. Have your finger on the pulse of our society. Have your finger on the heartbeat of what's going on. I think face the coming years, with the coming days, with positivity. And I think we will come back, and we will come back better than we were before. Actually, the pandemic has given us an opportunity, well, to right some of the wrongs, to correct some of the mistakes that we've made, to look at all of our wasteful habits, to do things better than we've done it before. And as I said, the Center Pompidou is coming to Jersey City, so I invite all of you to visit me in Jersey City, embrace art, look at art, and expand your world.